Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have made several advancements in the Kursk region, but have managed to capture 3 separate towns here in the northwestern and western parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance here to the west of Khodorkovy and to the southwest of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have also managed to regain some positions in the western flank of Pokrovsk, and they continue their counterattacks towards Peshane. The Russians were also pushed back in the direction of Toretsk, where the Ukrainians managed to regain a foothold within the city following the Russian capture of it, where they went into the stadium area in the northern parts of the city. This shows that the Ukrainians have not given up over the Battle of Toretsk. And something that I've noticed, which has changed in the nature of the defense of the Ukrainians, is that they have given up on these all-or-nothing offensive operations, which has been the cause of the Kursk incursion and the summer offensive of 2023. Instead, what I see is that the Ukrainians have switched the tactics around to more sustainable fighting, where we see that these local counterattacks, which are not all in, but instead some limited operations simply to destabilize the Russian progress and slow down the consolidation of their gains. And this shows that the Ukrainians have definitely learned a lot from previous battles. This is somewhere closer to the Ukrainian defensive tactics during the Battle of Bakhmut, the more successful ones. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see here that the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of the town of Lebedivka, as well as Orlovka and Pokrebki. The Russians also managed to cut off Novaya Soroshina by flanking from the western direction, cutting off the main supply route, and as attacks on the northern flank as well, they're putting it in a pincer from both the northern and southern flanks. However, the Ukrainians do still have some supply lines along the forest lines to the east, and the Russians are continuing offensive operations along the railway to the east to cut off that final supply line and hit the Ukrainian forces supplying the forces within Novaya Soroshina and prevent a withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces there. This will naturally lead to the Russians capturing Novaya Soroshina with little resistance, as the collapse of the defense near Orlovka has left the town vulnerable, and with the flanking maneuver cutting off the supplies, the Ukrainians there are in a very difficult position. Instead, the main force of the Ukrainians are located around Malaya Luknia, which is the main defensive position of the Ukrainians in the area. Therefore, we'll likely see that the Russians will look to pressure the Ukrainian forces from the northern flank towards Malaya Luknia, where the front line will stabilize again for the Ukrainians. Instead, the attack near the southern flank of Luknia in Lebedivka is much more significant, because we see here that the Russians are now lining the front line along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here north of Sucha, and they also captured the town here in between Sucha and Svetlikovo, the Lebedivka direction, creating a northern flank for their forces there. And with operations on the southern flank, this creates a proper buffer zone in both the northern and southern directions for further offensive operations towards Sucha from Svetlikovo. But we also see that this could be a potential operation by the Russians to push towards Luknia to gain control over the town, gaining control over and cutting off the pocket here west of Luknia, allowing for further offensive operations towards the river line itself, and also potential flanking maneuvers to cross over the defensive lines and cut off the railway connecting Sucha to the towns here in the north, which would operationally encircle the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces by Malaya Luknia and the surrounding towns. Gaining control over the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion would significantly improve the Russian offensive operations towards Sucha and their tactical position in the area. It will also allow the Russians to start flanking maneuvers towards the Ukrainian positions here near Cherkaskoe Porishnoe and the settlements along the forest patches here to the north of Sucha. This, combined with offensive operations towards Martinovka and control of this town, would allow the Russians to gain control over the entire northern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion and push the Ukrainian grouping all the way back to the Sucha direction and the village agglomeration alongside it. Therefore, we see that the Russian offensive operations here in the Kursk direction seems to be significantly improving, and with the capture of these towns, the Russians continued offensive operation mainly focused on the northwestern parts and the western parts of Sucha, but we've also seen some fighting in the eastern parts, but the northern parts has been fairly quiet. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line in the Toretsk direction, the Ukrainians managed to re-enter the city and gain control over parts here in the central area. The objective of the Ukrainians was to make use of the control over the waste heap near Krymsk to regain positions within the town, and their goal was to gain a foothold within the apartment complex area next to the stadium. The reason for this is the Ukrainians would have the ability to use these apartment complex buildings as a base of operations for further offensive operations within the city, and it is also within close proximity to the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city. If the Ukrainians regain a foothold within the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, they can regain positions and control over the entire northern parts of the city, with that as the central focal point and connection of the Ukrainian forces within the city. We see here that the Russians have not been able to properly establish defensive positions in the outskirts of the city, nor gaining control over the waste heap in the northern parts of the city, as well as the northwestern parts. This has allowed the Ukrainians to regain some positions and to re-enter through the use of the high ground and the monitoring of Russian forces. They found a gap in the Russian defenses and exploited it to gain control over the central parts of the city. And with this, the Ukrainians have an opportunity to use this foothold within the apartment complex area for a springboard for further offensive operations within the city. So we see that the Russian control over the city is now under threat due to this operation. The Ukrainians are still present within the forest patch area in the western parts of the city as well. This could allow the Ukrainian forces to connect their forces by the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city through a combined assault from the western and eastern parts to cut off the Russian forces at the front line in the northern parts of the city near the waste heap there, as well as the outskirts of the city. This means that the Russian positions in the northern parts of the city in its entirety is also under danger. So the Russians have really failed by not establishing proper defensive positions within the city and by not gaining control over the waste heaps in the northern parts of the city, and still failing to regain control over the eastern parts of Shcherbenivka and control over the forest patch area and the remaining parts of the fortified areas in the western parts of the city. The Ukrainians also have the advantage by having the high ground in the northwestern parts, and with the close proximity to Konstantinivka, the Ukrainians have good supplies in this area. So we see in general the Ukrainians have a good position despite the loss of the city, and the Russians have yet to properly consolidate their gains, and this has led to the Ukrainians gaining the upper hand and attempting this operation. Of course, this is also a very risky operation because the Russians can defeat them, and this will allow them to gain control over the waste heaps in the northern parts of the city, and this could deny further operations by the Ukrainians. But it is really a low risk, high reward kind of scenario because they don't really need a lot of forces at the start, but it could also be a trap by the Russian forces to destroy the Ukrainian offensive capabilities in the area. We have to wait until we see more details. Will this expand further or will it quickly die down? That will determine whether this is a successful operation or not. But we definitely see that the Ukrainian offensive capabilities in the area is not diminished. I call it a low risk, high reward because the amount of forces the Ukrainians need to use at the initial stage, this is not much. If they manage to gain control over the apartment complex area and then move onwards to gain a foothold within the central parts and combine that with an assault in the western direction as well, there could be significant gains for the Ukrainians by encircling the Russian forces in the northern parts of the city, while if it fails, they will not have lost too many soldiers. However, if it ends up in a stalemate where they will turn it into a meat grinder, there will be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to compensate their losses with any potential gains, and therefore it will become much more higher risk and lower reward the more time passes by. Therefore, this is a quick operation, and the longer it lasts, the more difficult and more costly and less rewarding it will become for the Ukrainians. Moving on to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians attempted some counterattacks in the direction of Peshane, but according to this geolocated footage, we see that a tank the Ukrainians was using to regain some positions here in Peshane was destroyed, and the Russians do have control over the entirety of the town as of right now. So we see that the Ukrainians continue their attempts to counterattack towards Peshane, but their success is very limited. In the direction of Kotline, Deep State Map reported that the town was controlled by the Ukrainians and regained by a counterattack by Ukrainian forces. However, the post by the Ukrainian forces is similar to the 47th Mechanized Brigade during the Battle of Stepove, where it's highly edited, and it is difficult to believe this sort of video that is released quite late. It is archival footage, not up-to-date footage, and we have already seen some counterattacks by the Ukrainians in the direction of Kotline since the 8th of February, so that is almost 3 weeks ago, somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks ago. So it's easy for the Ukrainians to have entered the town, regain control of it. The Russians then counterattack and regain control of it again, and then the Ukrainians claim they have control of it while they don't. And we see this based on the fact that the Russians over the 18th and 19th of February, 12 days after the Ukrainians started their counterattacks, managed to regain control over the industrial area northeast of Kotline and the fortified positions east of Kotline. So based on this, it is unlikely that this footage is accurate because the Ukrainians don't recapture a position, interview the soldiers involved in the mission at the same day as that happens. Instead, it will be at a later date, and that encompasses that this footage is old, and based on the developments that happened weeks ago, we can determine that it is not clear or evident that Ukrainians control Kotline based on this footage, and therefore I'm leaving it as a gray zone until the situation has been clarified. To the south in the direction of Uspenivka, we see a similar case. The Ukrainians counterattacked and regained some positions. The Ukrainian side claimed that they had full control over the town. Deep State Map claimed a full recapture of the town. However, today we received reports from the Russian side saying fighting continues in the central parts of the town, and the Ukrainians kicked the Russians out of the central parts, but now the Russians have re-entered the central parts with this new counterattack. So it's more of a back and forth. No side controls the entirety of the town, and the central parts is contested as it has been since the start of this month. Further south, the Russians have managed to advance south of Zaporizhia, getting control over parts of the forest lines to the south of the town as they continue their advances alongside the forest areas. The reason for this is to advance through the forest patches towards Bohdanivka, gaining foothold there, and then move onwards towards Toretsk with a combined assault from the eastern and southern direction. At the same time, fighting continues over Preobrazhenka in the northern and southern flanks as the Russians advance towards the town. To the west of Korokhove, the Russians continue their offensive operations within Constantinople, gaining control over the southern parts of the town and moving into the central parts as well. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the southwestern outskirts, where the Ukrainian forces have an outpost there and a defensive position located to defend against the Russian forces, and at the same time they advance northwards through the town itself to gain full control of it. So we see some back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces within Constantinople, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the town, and the Ukrainians are putting up fierce resistance. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.